Welcome to our viewers. Thank you so much for joining our roundtable discussion focused on the very important topic of diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. I'm Jameka Hill, Director of Patient Engagement, Advocacy, and Clinical Trial Diversity and Inclusion at Moderna. And within my role, I focus on developing strategies and tools that are aimed to improve clinical trial access. And I have the distinct privilege of also collaborating with patient advocacy and community organizations that are working to meet the needs of underserved and vulnerable populations. I spent my entire career in life sciences, which now spans almost 2 decades. I'm extremely passionate about improving clinical trial access to ensure traditionally underrepresented groups are included in clinical trials. And I'm particularly excited to be joined by 2 incredibly esteemed individuals who have dedicated their careers to addressing health equity. Dr. Jayne Morgan, Director of Innovation and Executive Director of the COVID-19 Task Force at Piedmont Healthcare, and Dr. Ashish Jha, Health Policy Researcher and Dean of Brown University's School of Public Health. Welcome. Before we get deep into our conversation, would love to hear a little bit more about each of you. Dr. Morgan, would you be willing to share a bit about yourself with us?
Sure. Thank you, Jameka. And I appreciate being here today and being invited. This is such an important topic. I am a cardiologist by training. I have spent a good part of my career in research, actually in industry at Solvay and Abbott, before coming to Piedmont to lead their cardiovascular research program, and then later innovation. And now, of course, in the pandemic, I am leading the COVID task force. You know, within this COVID task force and certainly within my career in research, we have a big focus on minorities, what that looks like with regard to minority recruitment into trials, how the COVID pandemic has really exposed and laid bare a lot of the social inequities that create somewhat of a barrier between populations of color and the healthcare system and research. And so I think this is a very sage topic. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, and I've spent a good part of my career focused on it and working to be a part of the solution.
Thank you. Dr. Jha, can you share a little bit about yourself with us?
Yes, I would be happy to. So my name is Ashish Jha, and I'm a physician. I'm a general internist and have practiced as a hospital-based physician for about 20 years. And then have been dean at the School of Public Health at Brown only recently. Before that, I was at Harvard running the Global Health Institute. And a lot of my research in my career has really focused on the structural and organizational barriers that limit access to high quality care for underrepresented minorities, particularly focused on Black patients in America. One of the things that I and others have found through our work is that healthcare is deeply segregated. It turns out that a small proportion of providers end up taking care of a large proportion of Black Americans. And so that really represents a policy challenge of thinking about how do we help those providers get better? How do we make sure they have the right resources, the right accountability? And that's been a pretty big focus. And then recently with the pandemic, in some ways, you know, watching the huge disproportionate effect of this pandemic on the African-American community and also on the Latino community, on Native American communities, in some ways you could argue it's not surprising, and yet the size of that effect, the devastation of that effect, I don't know, it continues to sort of take me back at just how deep these inequities are in our country. One area where I think we've done a good job, and I know we're going to talk more about this, is trying to make sure that as we study the vaccines, for instance, the clinical trials, focusing on ensuring we had a diverse population has been centrally important. I think that's one area we've done a reasonable job. Obviously, on the issue of vaccine rollout, equity has not been, despite all the talk, has not been, I think, has not gotten us where we need to be. And so that's an area where we need to continue to focus in the weeks and months ahead. So huge set of challenges, definitely areas where we've made progress, but a long way to go to having a really equitable health system.
All right, so we are here to discuss diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. But before we start, perhaps it's worth kind of taking a step back and talking about why research, including clinical trials, is important to begin with in kind of a more general sense. Prior to COVID-19, much of the world had never heard about a clinical trial, let alone participated in one. So Dr. Morgan, perhaps you can share a bit about why clinical trials are important.
Oftentimes when I give these talks, one of the things that is really important when we talk about certainly the African American community is the historical context. And because of all of the historical atrocities that have been committed against really Black people in the name of the advancement of medicine and science, there really isn't that relationship, a trusting relationship. It's really almost a non-existent relationship between Blacks and the research community. And yet, here we are 60 years past Tuskegee, and there really hasn't been any additional information to come in and fill that void. But what we know about clinical trials is that they offer our best and our brightest thinking. This is where we have an opportunity to access the healthcare system and to access therapies of tomorrow, today. It's an opportunity where people who are uninsured or underinsured can access the health system and provide and have coverage while they are within these trials to improve and to begin to narrow the gap in health equity. And many people talk about, I don't want to be a guinea pig, but when you're in these clinical trials, you have a principal investigator, a physician who's looking over you. That person generally has a regional physician who's overlooking them. Then there's a national physician overlooking the regional physician. You have a nurse coordinator or a research person with whom you have really direct contact such that you can report any side effects that are happening to you because the FDA wants that data to be accurate.
Dr. Jha, I'm curious your thoughts as well, especially from a public health perspective.
Well, we in public health, when we think about the big gains in public health, both from medicines, but also from changes in behavior, the interventions that we do to help people stop smoking and use alcohol more responsibly and deal with substance use disorders and other types of, or all sorts of other public health interventions, it's really critical to understand both which communities, which populations are really being harmed by these issues, and really to understand the context in which this happens. I'm struck by the fact that when you think about asthma and how we think about managing asthma, there are lots of people who have asthma, lots of kids who have asthma, but the context that gives rise to asthma is very different from neighborhood to neighborhood, community to community. And it's critically important if as a clinician, but as a public health person, you're going to make any kind of progress on it, you have to understand that context and you have to understand the neighborhoods and the communities and the homes and the local environment, the air people breathe. All of that has got to get factored in. Those are classically public health tools that we have to think about, which is one of the reasons why I always thought we have to do a much better job of marrying public health and clinical practice, because what you see on the clinical side of things is all the public health effects showing up in your clinic. And as a practicing physician, that's been my experience. And at the same time, the public health people need to understand that these broad issues that we work on around environment and social determinants, they have direct effects on people's health in ways that physicians and nurses can experience. So one of the things that I think has been really important in all of these issues is try to bring public health and medicine more closely together to tackle the inequities that we see in our society.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And kind of speaking to the inequities, can you talk a little bit about, as we look to communities of color and the importance, especially on including people of diverse backgrounds in clinical trials? Can you share a little bit about why that's of particular importance?
There's a whole set of reasons, right? We have to have clinical trials. I mean, historically, obviously, clinical trials have been very white. They've been very male oriented. And I mean, sort of where to begin with why that's a problem. It's a huge problem, certainly on issues of gender around biology. I mean, you think about cardiovascular disease, again, an area of Dr. Morgan's expertise. Men and women have different symptoms of cardiovascular disease. And if you do all your work in one group, you're not going to find it in another. When you get beyond the biology, again, I have brought up the issue of context, of people's lives and their lived experiences and their families, and how if you do not have diverse backgrounds, people of diverse backgrounds in your clinical trials, you will have a very narrow and incomplete understanding of how well your therapeutics work in your community, how well they work in society. And you will not really be able to understand fully whether these treatments are going to work across a broad, diverse population. And given what's happening in our country with an increasingly diverse population, the idea that we would go and study any therapeutic, any diagnostic, any preventive thing on one narrow slice and then make broad generalizations, it's just a really ineffective way of understanding what's happening. So I always think this is one where equity and effectiveness are actually perfectly tied together. If you want to know whether the drug is effective or not, or the vaccine is effective or not, you've got to have a very diverse population you study it in, so you can really see its broad set of effects.
So this has been an issue, though, that's been ongoing for a long period of time. The importance of ensuring that we have adequate representation from a biological and scientific perspective, so that we can make generalizable claims. Dr. Morgan, why are people of color still underrepresented in clinical trials then?
80% of African American patients are seen by African American physicians. And that is not by happenstance. That is intentional. And the reason that is so is because we first choose physicians where we feel safe. We are the only race to choose a doctor based on safety. Where will I go first? Where someone values my life equally to that of others. Where will I go first where someone will do no harm to me? Where will I first go where someone will listen to me and understand and have respect for my questions and give me time? No other race does that. And so if you have 80% of the population that is cloistered amongst physicians who are working in the community, those physicians have a lot of power and they need to be accessed. They have one foot in the medical system and one foot in the community. So these people need to be recruited, and we need to invest in them to become principal investigators. Over 97% of all principal investigators are white. There shouldn't be surprise that most people then who are enrolled in trials are white. The number one reason that people are enrolled in trials is if you are approached by a trusted physician. If your trusted physician is not participating in clinical trials, then you can see how this, pendulum just continues to swing. And so it's multifactorial. We certainly don't have visible leadership in research. So we lack that cultural congruence. We lack that influence, that voice at the table to ensure that equity is cascading down to our trials in these big health systems. And so it's many, many, many layers, including trust. And so it's not a problem that was created overnight, and it's not going to be solved overnight. It requires all of us to get together, but certainly the pharma, device, and vaccine companies have some responsibility, and they have an opportunity to begin to recruit and train African American physicians who are taking care of 80% of this population to represent and lead in these trials.
Yeah, I can attest to from, Moderna's side, certainly we've spoken very publicly about the challenges around ensuring that we have representative diversity in our phase 3 study for the COVID-19 vaccine in the US, and actually had to slow our enrollment to ensure that our trial was representative of the communities at highest risk and of our diverse society. And I know that that's one element. Adding principal investigators is another very important element. Dr. Jha, I'm curious from your side, what progress have you seen made to improve diversity in clinical trials? And is there something that we should be thinking of that we just haven't, yet broached as an industry?
Yeah, so I do think there's been progress. It's clearly been progress. And again, I don't want to overemphasize the vaccine trials, but I feel like they were a far step ahead of where how we've done things in the past. They look much more like America, and they needed to, because the truth is that we're not going to get past this pandemic until a broad swath of society feels comfortable getting vaccinated. And if people are not represented in the clinical trials, we would not be surprised if individuals from those communities are far less comfortable getting vaccinated. So I thought that slowing down of some of the trials, as frustrating as that was, because we all wanted it to go super duper fast, was the right thing, because we needed to get this right, because this is a long-term battle we had to win. And I thought that was really good. So yeah, so I do think that has been progress overall. We've seen progress. There's a list of things that any clinical trial PI, any organization can do. And I'm happy to talk about some of them, or all of them, but in the interest of time, I will make one broad point and then I'll list some specifics. The broad point is you got to get serious about this. You've got to decide that this is a fundamentally important part of the science, as opposed to something you kind of have to do around the edges to tick off a box or satisfy the institutional review board. You really have to decide that this is fundamental to the science of what you're trying to accomplish. And if you do, then there's a whole list of things. The FDA has put out guidance, others have as well, on how to have a diverse clinical trial. It's all about, and you've actually heard some of this already from Dr. Morgan, it starts with the trusted voices in communities. It starts with the providers who are already there. They're almost always the best source of recruitment of patients. If you're not working with those providers, if they're not part of the trial, if they're not engaged with you, you're gonna have a much, much harder time recruiting patients. It's about lowering the burden that it represents to join trials. I've thought about a lot of clinical trials where like you have set hours, you gotta come in between 9 and 5. Well, there are a lot of people for whom jobs make it really difficult to come in and take an afternoon off from 9 to 5. You got to think about that. You have to think about how to deal with that. You have to often widen eligibility of who's in and how you're going to think about it. There's a whole set of tools. And again, I don't need to recap what the FDA and others have laid out, but the fundamental thing is you got to say this is important and you have to make it a priority. And if you do, I think there are a lot of strategies people can use to make sure that they have a very diverse and representative trial.
Fantastic. Dr. Morgan, anything that you'd like to add from your side? I know you're especially passionate about this particular topic as well.
I think, from a population perspective, the importance of participation of all populations of color in clinical trials is such that people can have confidence that the data that is submitted to the FDA is relevant to them. And there's that lack of confidence as well in the population. The reason that lack of confidence is there is because there's not participation. The reason there's not participation is because there's not trust. So you see how this one thing begets the other. But, certainly these vaccine trials, as Dr. Jha said, did a phenomenal job. In fact, I've actually never seen trials that were not specific to a minority population enroll with such intent and purpose. And so you all should be congratulated for that. And I think that also lends the viewpoint. And certainly when I talk to populations of color, when we look at the swath of minority communities that are included in those trials, I am able to provide real data. Here's what you looked like in this trial. Here's what your numbers were 2 weeks after the second dose. Here's what that percentage means. That's a significant number. Of those 3 trials, we're talking about over 110,000 people, where an average of 10% of them were African American. This is not inconsequential. So I'm able to make that point and people understand that. And so I think at a population, people want to know that this data is relevant and that it will not harm me because we already know what it shows. And then you have to have someone who's able to educate and speak. Everybody is not in science. Everybody doesn't know what messenger RNA is. Everybody doesn't know what phase 1 or phase 2, what does that even mean? So you've got to have somebody who's able to explain it. So you need to have those trusted voices as well. These are all terms that are familiar to us, but the average person doesn't know what we're talking about. It's very confusing. And so we have to be able to have people who can communicate that. And one of the greatest tools in communication is if the vaccine companies, like all of the ones here, actually have real data that we can refer to and talk about, and then tell people that's you. Yeah. And then people get it.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, it just helps build trust, right? I mean, I can just speak for myself. Being represented in media or any matter really, right, helps me feel more confident that the information actually applies to me.
Right.
I'd love to get both of your thoughts on how, excuse me, how improving diversity and inclusion in clinical trials may help actually improve vaccine confidence overall. Dr. Jha, can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, I will. And can I just make one more comment that I was thinking of as Dr. Morgan was speaking, that the strategy we've talked about, the points Dr. Morgan made were right on. One of the things, though, that I think is important, and Dr. Morgan alluded to this a little bit, but I think it's worth highlighting, is that the clinical trial team, the people running the trial, also need to be diverse. Because the truth is, and I was one who said, you got to be motivated and you got to make this a priority. And I agree with that, obviously, because I just said it. But that alone isn't going to be enough. And if you do not have a diverse team of people involved in the research, your ability to execute, with all the intentions you may have, your ability to execute a trial that's really diverse, that's effective in that effort, is going to be diminished. So diversity of the clinical trial team, I think, often doesn't get talked about as much, but I just want to emphasize that I think it is really important. To your question, Jameka, about how the diversity of the clinical trials for the vaccines have affected uptake, it's interesting. There was a lot of talk for a little while about high hesitancy rates in the African American community of these vaccines. I have to say, as I listened to a lot of my African American physician colleagues talk about this, and really, I think, push back against that narrative and say, look, actually, a lot of it is about access. A lot of it is about the fact that, like, we don't have providers in our community who have access to vaccines. You've set up this mass vaccination site where I got to get in a car and drive for an hour. And then you're wondering, why am I not getting vaccinated? It's much more about access than it is about confidence. As that has gotten better, we have seen numbers of African Americans getting vaccinated at higher rates. There's still way too big of a gap. But I do think when you look at the survey data and the polling data, reasonably high levels of confidence in the African American community about these vaccines, partly because I think we did it right on the trials. If we had not done that, I would be very, very worried about where we were. But I think the vaccine hesitancy stuff now is much more concentrated in different groups, but we don't see the same effect. And I really do think that the gaps we're seeing still in vaccination rates is driven much more by access. And boy, we got to do a lot of work on improving access to vaccines.
And so as all of this is laid bare, I hope that once we get to the other side of this pandemic, it's not back to normal. I hear people say, I want to go back to normal. I hope we don't go back to normal. Normal didn't work for everybody. And I think this COVID pandemic has shown that. That should not be normal, that the suffering of people right in front of you is invisible. The edge in which they live in their lives is invisible and inconsequential to you. And so I hope lessons that we take forward, and people like Dr. Jha and myself and others who are speaking and trying to educate people, we make it difficult for the medical establishment to go back to business as usual. We cannot continue to practice medicine this way.
This has been a very rich conversation. I feel like we've touched on a number of really important topics. Considering it's nearing the end of World Immunization Week and Minority Health Month, are there any final thoughts that you can impart on us?
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things about this pandemic and what it has shown us, and why I also don't want to go back to 2019. It's interesting. I get asked a lot, when do we go back to normal? And I say never. And part of it is because pandemics change societies. And pandemics change societies for the better or for the worse, depending on what the people who live in those societies choose to learn from the pandemics and what they choose to act on. And so what happens next will not be a return to normal, but it will not necessarily be better unless we choose to make it better. So part of our job is to have conversations like this, to have hard conversations like this, and say that the medical community's got to just act differently. What's interesting, and I will I'll admit to a whole bunch of my own mistakes. One of the comments I made early on, and I'm going to be a little embarrassed to say this, but because I'll tell you that it was clearly the wrong way to think about it. Early in the pandemic, March of last year, I said something along the lines of, in some public forum, I said, COVID is the great equalizer. It's going to affect all of us equally. I know that that's like an incredibly embarrassing thing because I was completely wrong about that. COVID was not the great equalizer. It was the great revealer of all of the inequities, the structural inequities we have in our society. And it didn't just reveal them, it widened them, it sharpened them, it made it more plain. But the other part is it took us way too long as a country to identify that this was going on, months in fact. And then it took us too long to respond to it. And part of it, I've thought a lot about why did we get it so wrong? And why did it take us so long to get this right? And part of it is who sits around the table at the decision-making table, at the places where decisions are made. Who understands people's lived experiences? Who understands that when you have everybody's working from home, but you have essential workers and you have people who live in multi-generational households, that is a setup. That is a setup for some people getting infected at much, much higher rates than others. And who understands that then when you set up testing sites in leafy suburbs and not in the communities that are being hit hard, so then people don't even know that they're being infected until they're much, much sicker. Like there's just a series of decisions that were made that were not necessarily malintentioned, but they were decisions that were made that I think were made because the people who needed to be around the table weren't there. So there's a whole set of lessons that come out of this pandemic. I think we should absolutely celebrate the parts that we got right. And I do think the vaccine trials were one of the things. And thank goodness we got that right, because I think it'll make a really big difference in the long run. But as we pull out of this pandemic, I hope we learn those lessons. I hope we make sure that we have different people sitting around the table making decisions in the future. We need a far more diverse public health and medical leadership. So not just the workforce, but the leadership needs to be very, very different. And I think there's an opportunity here. I think there's an opportunity, a window that's opened up by this pandemic. And if we can seize it, it may be one of the silver linings of what has otherwise been a pretty horrendous year.
Yeah, silver lining is much needed, for sure. Dr. Morgan, please add your final comments as well. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I will piggyback on that. I was very dismayed by the vaccine rollout. And when we did the prioritization, I say we, I wasn't a part of it. Speaking of lack of inclusion, we have to be able to do better when this is said and done. We cannot go back to normal, because even in the midst of an open awareness of who was being impacted, we were still ignored and left out of the rollout.
What do we need to think about moving forward to ensure that there's representation across the different demographic subgroups?
Right. When we look at the diaspora of populations of color, the mosaic that really makes up the beauty of America, then we have to begin to not ignore these people or not pretend that everyone is equal. We need to see people for who they are. We're all individuals, all have different cultural things, all have beauty in different ways. And so that means that when you engage, you have to engage these communities, and you engage them, not only the leaders of the communities, but at the grassroots level, the actual people who are doing a lot of this sort of day-to-day, your average people in the community, because that's where the chatter is, that's where the trust starts to be built. And these are generally relationships that certainly large medical centers lack. That big companies, pharma, vaccine, device companies also lack those partnerships, those relationships. But that's very important. And I think that's where that starts. And you begin to develop those relationships before you need something. You develop those relationships when you want to go in and actually serve the community. And think about that as far as serving this community and understanding the community before you want to engage and bring them in. And so, all of these are just very important. It's so multi-layered. And when you talk about the Latinx community, the Native American community, the African American community, the approaches may all be different. And they all may be different within subcultures within those communities as well. And so, that's the point of cultural congruence, understanding that many people, especially populations of color, live dual existences where, we code change frequently. We exist in a majority world, and we also exist in our cultural world as well. And oftentimes those two are not the same.
Thank you both for your time, Dr. Morgan and Dr. Jha, and it's been an honor to have you part of our panel today. Also want to thank the viewers for sharing a part of your day with us to discuss the very important topic of diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. You all.